Thank you for joining me on my serialized podcast, 9 Lives. It's a collection of true stories about my life adventures, risk-taking, and near-death experiences. 9 Lives covers a timeline of 40 years, from 1960 up to the year 2000. I invite you to join me in this series of true and incredible accounts of thrilling adventures and more than a few occasions when it all might have ended for me. Welcome to episode 5 of 9 Lives. When life throws you a curveball. When life throws you a curveball, you face an unplanned problem or situation that is difficult or even life-threatening to deal with. Such was the case on my international air travels. Over 40 years, I'd traveled millions of miles on trips across continents, with frequent trips across the Pacific and the Atlantic on flights that were anywhere from 8 hours to 19 hours in length. I traveled on some of the world's leading airlines, and being a pilot myself, I felt very safe in their hands. However, there were times when I had to fly on less capable airlines, and I'm sure this first one will make you smile, or maybe question my sanity in traveling this way. I had started my travels in New York with an uneventful flight to Paris, on schedule and with exquisite service. My next stop would be to the capital of an Eastern European country, where I would spend several days at a conference. As part of this trip, I'd planned to go to a town in a sparsely populated rural area. There was just one flight every day in each direction. It was scheduled to leave the airport of the capital city at 10 a.m. each day, and I was advised to report to the airport at least 2 hours before. I did exactly that, and with very little difficulty finished up in the departure lounge, where I asked one of the airline officials if the flight was on time, and she assured me it was. Well, 10 a.m. came and went, 11 a.m., 12 noon, 1 p.m., and the friendly airline staff kept assuring me that the flight was on time. What I didn't realize was that their meaning of on time was it was going today. We finally boarded the flight at 6 p.m., for the short 45-minute flight to the remote town. I'm pleased to say that the return journey did depart and arrive on time at the capital city's airport. Now, when I'm waiting for a slightly delayed flight at home, and I'm with a crowd of passengers who are getting a little irritated by the delay, I reflect on my experience with that Eastern European airline. And then there's self-inflicted annoyance at air travel. I know this too well, having been the source of frustration of not being able to get where I was going. Here's a great example of that. It took place in the mid-70s, where I would make frequent stops in Tel Aviv, Israel, after doing business in Tehran, and then I'd hop on a flight to Paris and onwards home through New York. This was a time where there was détente between Iran and Israel. El Al, the Israeli airline, flew regular schedules from Tehran to Tel Aviv. I arrived in Tel Aviv in the early evening of Saturday the 26th of June, 1976, intending to have a very early morning breakfast meeting and then head for the airport for a flight to Paris and on to New York. The plan was to have our breakfast meeting at 6 a.m., then head to the airport around 7 a.m. or the latest 7:15 for the 15 or 20-minute drive to Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. The meeting went very well, but it dragged on a while, and I kept on reminding my Israeli friend of my flight departure time and the lengthy security check-in at the airport. Being ex-military and airport security, he assured me we would have plenty of time. We eventually departed just after 7:30 and headed towards Highway 1 that connects Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, along which is Ben Gurion Airport. It's a multi-lane divided highway, but within a mile of getting onto the highway, there was a problem. A large delivery vehicle had overturned on the freeway. It had probably only occurred a few minutes before we arrived, as recovery vehicles were just getting there. Yes, life had just thrown me a curveball. or at least my friend's confidence in getting to the airport on time for my flight to Paris. It became evident very soon that I would not make the flight. Frustrated and a little annoyed, we sat there for at least an hour when the road was cleared, allowing us to return to Tel Aviv. Although I really wanted to get home after several weeks on the road, another day wasn't going to make a big difference. So I booked another flight on TWA from Tel Aviv through Paris to New York on Monday the 28th of June. What I was yet to realize would be revealed in the newspapers the following day, that the flight that I'd been booked on, Air France 139, had been hijacked after a brief stop to pick up passengers in Athens and flown to Uganda's Entebbe airport. The flight had been hijacked by two Palestinian terrorists aided by two members of the Baader Meinhof gang, a left-wing German terrorist group. The hostages from that flight were eventually rescued on July the 3rd and the 4th of 1976 by a team of Israeli commandos. Had the curveball not happened that caused me to miss that flight, I would have been amongst the hostages. So when life does throw you a curveball, it may be for good reason. And sometimes when you're thrown a curveball, it might save your life. It certainly did in my case. The year was 1996. We were living on New York's Long Island and had been there since 1992. It was to be our last year there, as we were soon to move to San Diego. My company was developing some advanced technology that was to bring about a dramatic change in how television was broadcast. And being the leaders in this field, it required me to travel extensively overseas to meet with collaborators and partners in Europe and also in Israel. My preferred route in traveling to Europe and also onto Israel was from New York Kennedy Airport to Charles de Gaulle in Paris, and then on to wherever I had to go. This was much easier than going through London, a less convenient hub for routes into Central Europe. I made frequent trips from New York to Paris on TWA, and as a member of their 1 Million Mile Club got very special attention, which made traveling that much easier. The flight that I would take would be TW800, whose destination was Rome, with a stop in Paris. I had taken this trip dozens of times over the past 4 years. I considered TWA to be one of the safest airlines in the world. They had an exemplary record for safety for over 60 years. I was always comfortable flying on TWA. However, that exemplary record was to be broken when TWA 800, a Boeing 747-100, exploded and crashed into the Atlantic Ocean in the early evening of July 17, 1996, just off the shores of Long Island. I had many times sat on the left side of the airplane, watching Long Island disappear below me. After taking off from New York's JF Kennedy Airport, the flight would head out to the Atlantic, climbing to a cruise altitude along the south shores of Long Island. And on this fateful day of Wednesday, July the 17th, 1996, I was once again booked on that flight. But this time, the curveball that was thrown at me saved my life. More about that in a little while. On board the fatal TW800 flight were 230 people, including 18 crew and 20 off-duty employees who were scheduled to cover the Paris to Rome leg after the flight arrived in Paris. The majority of passengers on that flight were Americans, which included 16 students and 5 adult chaperones from the French club of the Mortisville Area High School in Pennsylvania, a small borough of about 5,000 residents. Such a tragedy for this tight-knit community. I would normally leave for Paris at the weekend, either on a Saturday or Sunday, to arrive in Europe for the following business week. The curveball that was thrown me this time was a delay in preparing the materials that I needed for the trip. I thought I could still rescue some of the week if I could get to Paris on Thursday morning and have Thursday and Friday meeting with colleagues in France. That would mean leaving on TWA 800 by the latest July 17th, or I would have to delay the trip until the following week. I made every effort to make it, However, it was not to be. I called TWA, cancelled my flight on July the 17th, and moved it to the following Sunday, which was my normal schedule. The curveball of not having the material ready for my trip was the one that saved my life. And now finally, in episode 5, another life-saving event. In 1975, I was flying regularly from South Africa to Iran. It was to review an impending project that I might become involved in. The most direct route from Johannesburg to Tehran was through Tel Aviv. During that time, relationships between Tehran and Tel Aviv were friendly, under the Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi. El Al, Israel's national carrier, provided daily flights from Johannesburg to Tehran via Tel Aviv. They were not direct flights, but connecting flights, which had 3 to 4 hours of connecting time in Tel Aviv. The airline provided nice accommodation at a local hotel, to which they provided transportation to and from the hotel and transferred the baggage from the Johannesburg flight to the Tehran flight without passengers even having to touch them. All you had to do was identify your bag on the carousel and then leave from the exit door to the bus that would take you to the hotel. On this particular occasion, on May the 25th, 1975, I was traveling in first class and the first off the airplane. I got to the carousel, pointed out to my baggage, and a nice young lady said, "Good morning, Mr. Dunford. Please go to the hotel, and we'll collect you later." As I turned away from the carousel and walked towards the exit doors, which were 2 large interlocking doors, I pushed one, went through, and the door slammed behind me. At least, that's what I thought I heard. The banging of the 2 doors coming together. That was not so. What had happened was, a booby-trapped suitcase had exploded on the carousel. Had I not been one of the first off the airplane, and promptly left the customs hall, where incoming passengers take their luggage from the conveyor belts, then I would have been caught up in the mayhem that followed. On my return to Johannesburg from Tehran a couple of days later, I met with friends who told me that the booby-trapped luggage was apparently brought to Israel by a man flying on board an Austrian Airlines flight from Vienna. Ben Gurion Airport has some of the tightest security in the world and remains a prime target for Palestinian terrorists, since it's Israel's principal link to the outside world. I saw none of the devastation left behind, as I was promptly ushered onto the bus and safely transported to the hotel. According to reports in the newspaper, an airport security guard noticed something suspicious about a man as he left the plane, and directed him to a security booth in the customs hall. As he opened the small red suitcase he was carrying, the bomb exploded, killing both the guard and the passenger. According to reports, a few minutes later, officials spotted a second suitcase on the conveyor belt and rushed it to the security pit as it exploded. Although I've traveled dozens of times through Ben Gurion Airport since that occasion, I often reflect on the fact that May the 25th, 1975 could have been my last day alive. Thank you for joining me on episode 5 of 9 Lives. Please join me again for episode 6 of 9 Lives on June the 13th, when I'll recount some hair-raising events during time spent in a small West African country.